Daggone it. For whatever reason, that should do it. Yes, all right. Are you guys there? Fantastic. Okay, so we left off with the Pilgrims. Did I have any questions about the Pilgrims and the settlement of Plymouth? All right, so we know that the Puritans are Calvinists, they're Congregationalists. There are a couple of different groups here. We've got the Separatists, there were the Pilgrims that had gone to Holland, and then they weren't too happy because they were having an identity crisis. Their families, their children were starting to become a little too Dutch for their liking. Not to mention they were worried about losing their rights as English men and women. So they appealed to the Virginia Company in London to come over and settle Plymouth, and they are hanging on by a thread, but they managed to make it work. They carve out this colony. It barely has 100 people within the first couple of years, but by 1691, when it is absorbed by Massachusetts, it'll be just over 3,000. As far as the other group of Congregationalist Puritans, that group is going to be what we would consider reformists. They actually want to reform the Anglican Church of England. You all are familiar with this group. Remember when you learned about the Roundheads and Oliver Cromwell and that old group? That's the group that the Puritans were backing. As far as this particular group, what we've got going on here is that they want to carve out a colony specifically for religious freedom. They are going to do something differently than the charlatans of Jamestown had done. They are going to settle with families. They are going to settle to spread their religion. Remember, the Calvinist religion is all about converting. They want to genuinely come over and convert natives. They know what's happened to Jamestown. They know what's happened to Plymouth. They've got a pretty good idea of how they need to establish this colony. Their leaders are going to be a little bit different than the joint stock company that we knew as the Virginia Company of London. The Massachusetts Bay Company, a lot of those leaders and investors are actually going to come over and settle in Massachusetts Bay. In fact, they bring their charter with them as sort of a form of a constitution. The leader that they choose is going to be a Puritan minister who was educated at Cambridge. Most of the Puritan ministers were, which I'll talk a little bit about that here shortly. And they are going to end up settling on a city upon a hill, and they will name it Boston in honor of Boston in Lincolnshire, the holy city of Boston that they had left in England. When they arrived at about 11 ships, roughly 1,000 settlers. This is a significantly large migration. This is the largest migration of a group of Englishmen up to this point in time. And they're going to set up shop in and around Boston. And has anybody visited Boston before? So if you've ever visited Boston, it's a deep port, but we also know that there are fresh water sources that run into Boston Harbor. So this was a pretty solid location, and one that they knew about because, as we already know, English explorers have already been in this region. How are they going to make their money? Well, we know that they're going to run their government by the church doctrine. They're going to make their money through fur trade, lumber. A bit ironic, rum production. They frowned upon the consumption of alcohol, even though everybody kind of drank a little bit of alcohol at this period of time. They weren't real big on the consumption of rum, but they were definitely big on the production and making money. Fishing, historians will famously say that Massachusetts Bay was built on cod and God. A lot of wealth to be made off the fishing business, and later shipbuilding in the city of Boston. Really, when we're looking at New England, Boston is pretty much the largest, most significant colonial city, so to speak, an urban center at this period of time. Some of this, we'll be learning about some of the smaller settlements in and along New England, but Boston by far was the largest. Winthrop will lead the colony for 19 years, which is pretty incredible. He really leads sort of as a religious dictator, so to speak. It is a democracy. It is an Athenian-style democracy, where if I said to everybody, hey, I need you guys to vote whether you guys want to get out of here 10 minutes early today, can I see a show of hands? Oh, majority rules? All right, who wants to stay for the whole time? Okay, go. Sorry, majority rules, we're getting out of here early. All right, that's Athenian-style democracy, and then a lot of you all didn't vote. That also, that's good that a lot of you didn't vote, because that was also an issue here too. The fact that a lot of the people that were there, they didn't have an opportunity to vote maybe. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So we got John Winthrop. This is a depiction of the famous prayer / sermon / speech, City Upon a Hill. And again, they are here for pious religious purposes. Any questions about Winthrop or the early Puritans? Okay, so again, even though they're not totally fond of it, the governors of the Massachusetts Bay Company and investors will agree that democracy is the way to go. Town meetings are going to be essential. Church will be the center of communities. Preachers and parishioners will come together in these communities to form, local and community support. They'll abide by the laws of the Massachusetts Bay Company, and only about 2/5 of the male population was actually able to vote. That meant you had to be white, 21, and you had to be a church member. So this didn't set right with everybody, because there are a lot of people that were converted and they believed, but they were not eligible to vote. So women weren't allowed to vote. Converted natives were not allowed to vote. Later, free African Americans and African slaves who were converted were not allowed to vote. So a lot of people are left out of the picture. Not to mention a lot of white males who felt like, hey, I came all the way across to the New World. I'm living, I'm surviving. I've pitched in to help build this colony, and I'm not allowed to vote. This is messed up. I'm out of here. And that's going to be political freedom is going to push a lot of people out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So again, Winthrop and some of those folks, they weren't always supportive of democracy, which Winthrop called the meanest and worst, but knew that there had to be some democratic rule because so many people were pitching in to make this holy experiment work. A lot of these folks are really well educated, especially their ministers. Most of your Puritan ministers would have been educated in either Cambridge or Essex, and we're going to see that early on the first English college will be established, Harvard, named for the large benefactor John Harvard, who pays for it, and it'll be established right outside of Boston in the settlement named for where many of them were educated, Cambridge. So Harvard originally established to educate clergy. We'll talk about during the First and the Second Great Awakening how curriculum changes in higher education. So we'll get to that a bit later. John Cotton, another prominent Cambridge-educated clergyman from England, that comes over to help lead the colony. Congregations could not only hire but also fire their ministers, and congregations started spreading out into little communities like Salem, Concord, Lexington, places in and around Boston, right? What's Salem famous for? Yeah, the witch trials, which we're going to talk about in lesson 4. They also go back to this that Calvinistic doctrine, like the idle work theory, the idle hands are the devil's tools, limit on earthly pleasures. You could be fined or flogged. You know what flogged is? Yeah, beaten publicly for public display of affection, right? That's kind of hard to wrap your head around. So no kissing in public in Puritan Boston. The concept of hell was fire and brimstone, okay? In fact, the First Great Awakening sermons of Jonathan Edwards grew out of this era. Are y'all familiar with Jonathan Edwards? He's a guy that wrote the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You're a spider dangling over the flames of hell, only to be dropped. You must repent. The skulls of unbaptized children pave the road to hell. Pretty hardcore rhetoric, right? That's what it was, the Puritans, that was what they were bringing to the table. Who's doing their research on Wigglesworth? Somebody chose Wigglesworth out there. So Wigglesworth is going to be one of these guys. He's a Congregationalist that puts together a book sort of as like to support the doctrine. It's called Day of Doom, and it's definitely like it's a fire and brimstone support of repenting, be pious, be a visible saint. We're going to talk about visible sainthood in the Puritan church, especially when we get to the witch trials. And this was written and published in 1662. And the only thing that sold more copies amongst the Congregationalists than Day of Doom was the Bible itself. Here we have John Cotton and Winthrop. Any questions about the Puritans? We good? Cool. All right. So, trouble brewing in the Bible colony. I think that we all did a really good job earlier. Iris, Hunter, Jalen pointing out different parts of what might have led to the colonies spreading out and splintering in New England. And much of it comes down to the tension over religious dissenters. And it's quite ironic, and I thought that Iris did a really good job of pulling out the irony of the situation. What was ironic was this is a group of people that were being persecuted under King James I. They were persecuted under Charles I. And they wanted to find a new place to practice their religion freely. But when they arrive and they start setting the ground rules and establishing the church doctrine and their political framework, they themselves were persecuting groups as well. So one group in particular that comes about, and I know this is kind of like an interweaving between the English Civil War, because if you think about it, like this colony is rising up around the same time the English Civil War is taking place. And what comes out of the English Civil War is a group that is known as the Society of Friends, aka the Quakers, that is led by a guy named George Fox. And that group, there's no Pennsylvania yet, okay? There's no Pennsylvania colony. We'll be talking about that next class. So Quakers are coming over to the New World trying to find refuge, and they do not find it in Massachusetts Bay. In fact, when the Pequot Wars and some of the other Indian wars like King Philip's War are raging on, Quakers are not interested in fighting. Not to mention, many Quakers believe that Native Americans should be paid for their land. So this leads to Quakers being fined, flogged, banished, and a lot of them end up winding up in New Amsterdam, and later they'll wind up in Philadelphia and in in the colony of Pennsylvania, which will be the Quaker colony. So, Roger Williams. Talk a little bit about him. Roger Williams is another Cambridge-educated Puritan minister who is coming over to become the preacher for the settlement of Salem. Okay? Comes over, and he does not agree with the fact that the Puritans are not allowing for a separation of church and state, which is as I mentioned before, is a principle that we live with day in and day out. And this founding principle that we have and hold near and dear as American citizens, the separation of church and state, is one that got him banished from Massachusetts Bay. So he'll wind up heading to Providence, establishing the settlement of Providence, and establishing the colony of Rhode Island. Another dissenter that I want to bring up is Anne Hutchinson. She was a woman that believed that the Word of God was not only in the Bible, but was a word that could be spoken to man or woman. Okay? And she was put on trial for this. And it wasn't just that. And her rebuttal was, did God not speak to Abraham? Well, they said, well, yeah, why would he speak to you? Essentially, they're saying, why would God speak to you? You're a woman. And why do you think you have the right to preach or teach anyone? You're a woman. And she said, I do have that right to preach and teach, regardless of the fact that I'm a woman, and that gets her banished. So she winds up in Rhode Island for a short time, and then she moves on to New York. And in a weird, bizarre twist of fate, Anne Hutchinson and her family will be involved in a Native American attack that was caused by Dutch settlement in New Amsterdam and the ramping up of the end of the Pequot Wars and the King Philip's War. And the Puritans used that attack on her and her family as justification where, well, you know what? She got what she deserved. She was smited for her ways, essentially as a heretic, is what they believe. But, this might not seem bold in the 2000s, but this is a bold maneuver at this period of time. So religious dissenters start to splinter off into their own colonies. Here we have Roger Williams on the left, Anne Hutchinson on the right, two Puritan dissenters. So a little bit about Rhode Island, Little Roddy, the colony established by Roger Williams. Not everybody was there for religious reasons, but a lot of people were. The people in Massachusetts Bay referred to it as the sewer colony because it was all the people that had gotten kicked out of Massachusetts. Williams will separate church and state, government. He also paid the Narragansett, which were an Algonquian tribe, for the land at Providence and in present-day Rhode Island. He was against special privileges, didn't force any oaths to the church, nor did he collect church taxes. This was pretty revolutionary for this period of time. Relations were cooperative with natives for a time, but ultimately the Pequot Wars and King Philip's War pulled Rhode Island into war with natives. And in 1644, Roger Williams will be granted a royal charter. Do keep in mind, when the New England Confederation forms, which I'm going to talk a bit about in our next lesson, it's in this lesson, but I'm not going to get to it today, the Rhode Island will be the only New England colony that doesn't join up with that New England Confederation. So they continue to remain independent, but they will fight, they will get pulled into the war, and ironically, Roger Williams himself will be involved in these Native American wars. All right, so New England spreads out. Another dissenter is going to be Thomas Hooker. Who was doing their research on Thomas Hooker out there? All right, cool. So Thomas Hooker Another highly educated Congregationalist minister settles in Massachusetts Bay and can't believe that parishioners that are devout to the church but not officially church members don't have the right to vote. This doesn't sit well with Hooker. So he leads a group of nearly 100 to present-day Hartford. They're going to establish a colony that will become Connecticut. It's originally New Haven. And this particular colony is set up with what would be considered one of the oldest constitutions in the Americas. It's known as the Fundamental Orders. It is a written colonial constitution that allowed its parishioners to vote through secret ballot. It is one of the oldest forms of secret ballot in America, period. This will ultimately lead to the founding of the collegiate school in New Haven to educate Congregationalist clergy, and that will be the third English college established in colonial America. We know it today as Yale. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is our second colonial college? We've talked about the first, and we talked about the third. William and Mary, good job. Excellent work. William and Mary. William and Mary is established in Williamsburg to educate Anglican clergy. So, Harvard, 1636, William and Mary, 1693-94, and Yale, or better known originally as the Collegiate School, 1701. Maine, never its own colony. It was part of Massachusetts, but keep in mind the port city of Portland is going to be important for moving goods in and out, shipbuilding, naval stores, lumber, rum. We'll talk more about Maine and, oh yeah? Already? Seems a little early, especially since I see 4 minutes over here. Nice try. All right, nice try. All right, so granite and lumber-rich New Hampshire was absorbed into Massachusetts, and ultimately New Hampshire becomes its own royal colony during Charles II's reign in 1679. That's going to be a colonial boom that we're going to talk a bit about later. And again, New Hampshire is a colony. Yeah, people want to settle there for religious purposes, but a lot of folks want to settle there for economic opportunity and political opportunity. Here we have Thomas Hooker. This is the last thing that I want to get to today. So we talked about the Pawtuxet and Wampanoag alliance that the Pilgrims had with Chief Massasoit and Squanto, and how they will celebrate that first Thanksgiving due to a military alliance and an attack on neighboring rival tribes. There are powerful tribes in and around the region, and those tribes include the Wampanoag, the Narragansett Algonquian, the Mohegan, but the most powerful of all of them is the Pequot. The Puritans are tangling with the Pequot over mainly economic reasons, and in 1637, some Puritan traders, not as in like treason, but merchants, are killed by some Native Americans. Still to this day, it's hard to really pin down whether they were Pequot or not. This leads a band of English Puritan officers to create an alliance with rival tribes, the Narragansett and the Mohegan, to attack the Pequot village on the Mystic River in Connecticut. This ultimately leads to not just an attack in May of 1637, but a full-on massacre that leads to the burning down of this fort, the death of not just the Pequot warriors, but also the women and children inside the fort, and an all-out war against the Pequot from 1637 into the early 1640s, where most Pequot will either be killed or sold into slavery in the Caribbean. There is a decent period of peace but it is a shaky peace. Thanks, guys. It is a shaky peace, and it is a peace that will fall apart in what will become known in 1675 to 1676 as King Philip's War. He is not a king, he is a chief. You may not know him, but you know his father. His father was Massasoit. Metacom is the chief of the Wampanoag. He's had enough. He feels like their land, their culture, and their way of life has been trampled on long enough. And he decides to unite a group of an entangling alliance of enemies for a very long period of time that predates the Pilgrims and Puritans, and brings these people together to launch attacks throughout New England. This set of attacks will begin in 1675, where Metacom, the Wampanoag, and tribes that involve all of the other previous alliances that the natives had had, and some tribes that they had yet to deal with, to attack 52 towns and destroy 12. Hundreds of English settlers are going to die, but they will wage all-out Irish tactic, de-la war tactic warfare on Metacom and the Wampanoag and their allies. The final battle will be at the Battle of the Swamp. The reason that they are successful is because of sheer numbers. They do come together as a confederation to form a militia. The only group not in that English New England Confederation will be Rhode Island, but Rhode Island will fight alongside the English, even though they weren't formally in the Confederation, and they will defeat Metacom at the Battle of the Swamp. He will be shot, decapitated, and his head will be piked and stay there and rot for years to come in the town of Plymouth. His warriors were tortured and killed. Family was sold into slavery in Bermuda. It's a brutal system of warfare that was waged between the two groups. On the left here is a primary document. It shows you, this is the fort along the Mystic. This is the Pequot fort along the Mystic. You can see once it set fire and the Pequot were trying to get out of either side, they were just being attacked by either English, Mohegan, or Narragansett on either side, even people trying to climb out. So they were either burnt, they either died of smoke inhalation or were burnt to death, or they were killed trying to get out. And then this is King Philip, Metacom, who received that name because he dressed in English attire. Any questions for me? All right.